Hello and welcome to lesson 4 of our series on portraiture. So we have been so far exploring drawing techniques. So we've been looking at using a grid technique. We've looked at working out how to get the proportions of a head using the Loomis technique as well. And then we looked at using line in order to add tone and shadow to a portrait. Along with some white pen, and then last week we started to apply some colour. So we started by adding some washes of ink or even big brush strokes of ink before adding a drawing onto that of another portrait, and using then a black rollerball pen and a white pen basically to add the highlights into that. So this week the plan is to start using some acrylic paint on our portraits, and then adding an underpainting using a technique called grisaille. So the grisaille technique is lots of thin layers of paint in a monochromatic style, which means to use a very limited colour palette, perhaps just one colour. Or one range of colours anyway, and then over the top of that you start adding your skin tones. So I've chosen to look at some cultural portraits, so portraits from all over the world. So we've got anything from Japanese portraits, Papua New Guinea, Amazonian portraits, African portraits from photographs that have been taken all over the world. So we've got these beautiful beads and lots of texture and some beautiful expressions and things like that as well. So we're going to use that as inspiration and perhaps also bring in some collage techniques in there as well. So we'll go over to the wall and we'll have a look at the things we've got to offer there today, and I'll just talk you through how I'm going to be tackling what we're doing this evening. Okay, over we go. So this is what we did last week. So we looked at this artist just over on the right hand side of your screen there, Noel Badges Pugh, who I discovered on the internet just a couple of weeks ago, and you can see he's used these bright inks in the background and then started to apply pen marks over the top to bring out the features of the face, and then perhaps even a little bit of more acrylic maybe even over the eyelashes there, but again a nice warm color palette, but with perhaps in the shadows and around the eyes we've got some blues in there. So taking a little bit of inspiration from there, we did our own portraits where we put some ink down first. I also did a little bit of a splattering technique with a brush, flicking the paint or the ink onto the surface, which was watered down slightly so it wasn't too intense, and then after that drawing the portrait over using the Loomis technique or a grid if you prefer, and then applying the dark shadows with a rollerball pen and the highlights with a white pen. So we did a lot of that last week. We're going to move towards using some acrylic paints today, so we'll put those away for now. If you need to finish those off you can do, and just get going on this next task as soon as you're ready. So here's an example of how an underpainting might work for a portrait. So you can see in the center there the tones and shadows they don't have any skin tone in them, but they are using both a white and a very deep brown color, which I'll explain how to mix that a little bit later. But then you've got all the undertones, or you've got all the tonal range of the portrait, so you don't have to worry about the skin tone. You just have to worry about how to make this thing look three-dimensional, or give it that illusion anyway. And then after that, on the other side, you can see how the skin tones have been applied over the top as well. Anything down to the nice rosy cheeks she's got there and the hair colour. So we start off on the left hand side with a drawing, added the tones and shadows on top, and then adding the skin tones over that. We're going to be a bit more adventurous than perhaps this is, although you might feel this is quite adventurous, but the type of portraits we're going to be looking at are really beautiful and colourful as well. So we'll have a look at those next. So the artist that I found to show you this week is an artist called Stephanie Ledoux, and I've come across her quite a few times when teaching art at school. But as you can see, we've got lots of experimentation going on in this picture. We've got pictures, we've got text in the background there. So maybe the whole of the picture here was collaged before then the drawing was done and the painting was done. We're going to start with just putting a base of colour down today, and then using the grid to get an accurate outline of the whole of the portrait, before then applying colour just to the face, and later on adding some collage into the background, which we can also work over and paint over a little bit later on. One of the interesting things that I noticed about this is that it has real objects on it as well. So if you look closely there, I know this isn't a very good picture, but you can see how there's real earrings hanging from this lady's ears on here. So Stephanie Ledoux has added those on there as well, so it creates a whole different feel to the picture. So we've got a mixed media approach going on here, but we're going to begin with acrylic paints and perhaps underpainting, and then work back over the top of that. Another artist that I'm also reasonably familiar with from my work at schools is Delita Martin, who as you can see here, she's done a painting underneath with this beautiful flowery sort of snowdrop type pattern in red and white, and then the portrait has been painted back over the top. The interesting thing I've just thought of or noticed here is that the picture is just in black and white, obviously for the face, but we've got some highlights added in there, and the little circles that are on her face, which almost look a little bit like some of the ones on Stephanie Ledoux's portrait, are these lovely dots going around the face, or circles, which is reminiscent, I suppose, of the African decoration on the face, or the body adornment on the face there. So that's a bit more of a contemporary, well, they're both contemporary, but I suppose the subject matter in this one is a little bit more contemporary. But this is some of the inspiration that I hope we can take forward with this painting. Okay, so I've decided to work on a portrait of a girl from a tribe, a bit similar to the one we've got up there, but you can see it's got nice highlights and gentle shadows, lots of pattern, and lots of a little bit of face paint and lots of beads. So it's really interesting. The idea is what I'm going to do is create something a little bit like Stephanie Ledoux, where she's got all the patterns and textures in the background as well. So I'm going to change the background of this one. So when we're doing this underpainting, we're going to be using a limited color palette, as we said. So I shall be mostly using ultramarine and burnt umber, mixing those two together to create a really nice, dark, almost black looking color that we can use for the shadows, and mix that with white. So when you mix those two together, those two colors together, you get a very dark shade, but then you can add white to it and you get a nice gray, and we can vary that as we go across, applying the colors reasonably thinly, before then later adding some more skin tones. So you notice on this face how there's quite a range actually. When you look closely, you on the forehead there, on the highlight, you can see it's kind of a bit bluey. And then in between her eyes, you've got this golden sort of brown. And then if we come down, we've got a little bit of pink on the lips and so forth. So there's a lot to look at here. And one of the other things I noticed is the lovely shadow coming down from her headdress, just under there, across her eye and down over her face paint. there as well. And we've got these gorgeous colours down here, which I may decide to collage with some different papers and things a little bit later, but we shall see how we get on. So we'll go over to the desk now and have a look how I've got started. The other thing I forgot to mention here is that I'm going to do an overall bit of colour underneath here and then paint over the colour. So the idea of that is that you can see the highlights and you can see the shadows very clearly on the image. All right, so over to the desk now to have a look at what we're doing there. So we are looking at these pictures of African, or not African, but different cultures from all over the world, dressed in their customary wear, and we're going to create some portraits where we hope to include a little bit of collage and so forth into the background, like an artist that we've looked at called Stephanie Ledoux, I beg your pardon. So basically the work started off with creating a background. You will have just seen me add a background color in there. So that was a sap green, and the idea of that is it's a mid-tone that then we can draw back over or paint back over the top of, in order to bring out the highlights and the shadows in the image. So we're using a limited color palette for this again, and you can see I've just added in the whites of the eyes in order to start making things stand out. And I often start with the white of the eyes, or the eyes for painting a portrait, because it starts to bring things alive very quickly when working in this way. So the idea here is that you can very lightly put on thin layers of paint over the top of a drawing and over the top of the background in order to start adding just the tones and shadows. On the palette there you can see I've got the colours that I'm using, of course. So I'm using an ultramarine and a burnt umber to create a chromatic dark, almost like a black colour, and then when I mix a little bit of white with that, you can start to get lighter tones, obviously, but it comes out kind of a greyish sort of colour. Now the idea of this is that you can add in all of the tonal ranges on your portrait before then starting to apply some more of the chromatic colours of the skin tones back over the top. So we're gradually building this up, and I'm doing this cautiously, really. I'm adding a little bit of water to my paint, so you've got a certain amount of transparency coming through there. And when the paint is really wet, it will look a bit darker or a bit lighter in the case of the highlights, and then it will sort of taper off and become much more softer. Now this, of course, will encourage you to start layering another layer of colour over the top and build up successive layers of colour. So one of the things to remember about acrylic paints is they dry very quickly, so it's important to add a little bit of water as you're going along in order to keep mixing it. But remember that the nice thing also about acrylics is that you can keep layering colour on top of each other. So if there's slight things that you're not happy with, you can paint back over it in a short amount of time, basically because the paint will dry very quickly, unlike oil, which dries very slowly, which is nice for blending actually. But with acrylic paint, because it dries nice and quickly, you can apply another layer over the top. And if you want to blend it a little bit more, you add a bit of water so that you can see through the layer of paint that you're adding. But you'll get the idea once you start playing around with it and everything. So here I've started around the eye, and you can see I've built in the colour and everything, or the tonal range around the eye, and I keep tweaking that as we progress through this piece of work. So I'm just, the nice thing about this is you do a little bit at a time, and you really get to examine very closely the work that you're doing in order to learn a little bit more about what you're looking at. So just here I'm adding various highlights and tones, and then blending those back out again and softening them. And I keep doing that around the nose here to bring out the different nostrils and stuff on here. And then it's also nice when you start adding a little bit of contrast next to some of the shadows and things too. So this technique is actually called a grisaille technique. It's where you add all the tones before then working back over with some of the more some of the skin tones back over the top with thin layers of paint. It's a technique that was used by the Renaissance painters when they painted their portraits. You'll see some very sort of strange looking tones going in, but they're the basis or the base of the final painting. I do get kind of distracted a little bit, I suppose, by the different warm tones that I can see in the skin as I'm working, but that's okay, because I can come back and add some very thin layers of more colour over the top to really bring out the tonal, the skin tones or the skin colours a little bit later. But it's quite absorbing when you get going on this, because you really sort of get into the flow, I guess, of painting your portraits. So if you're watching this having missed the daytime class, I'm sorry that all the other details aren't on the video, but hopefully I'll have fixed all the technical issues for the next video. So I'm resisting painting the other eye so that I can paint it in class tomorrow. And then I can show people again how to do these techniques. So as I mentioned earlier, the artist Stephanie Ledoux uses newspapers in the background of her imagery. Newspapers, photographs, various things. She collages them into the background and then paints over them. So normally what I would probably do is work over the whole of the image with the collage before then painting on top. But I thought it'd be interesting to do a little bit of a mixed media piece and concentrate and give you a chance to concentrate on the painting directly over a background before then applying the collage and things, and maybe even bringing some of those elements into things like the headdress. I know that somebody in the evening class is painting an American, Native American person, and is using the headdress as perhaps an idea for applying collage techniques on top. So I also add, as I'm working, I can see hints of blues in the shadows and warmer colours just in the middle between the eyes there. So I'm already thinking about some of those ideas. And here I'm using some blue in the shadows to make those shadows a bit more evident and to sink them down there as well. You can see what I'm doing here is I'm adding very thin layers of paint over the top of each other. Once that paint starts to build up, it does kind of create a little bit of a barrier between there and the paper, so it becomes easier to work as you go. But to begin with, you don't want to over water the paper, or once you put water down, at least you don't want to add or keep reworking the image, otherwise it's going to wear the paper down. So the reason I say that is because I'm using just a normal cartridge paper here, but you may decide to use something like a watercolor paper. Anyway, that's the end of this video. It's a very short one today, but next week hopefully we'll have a slightly longer session, or with a bit more detail. Thanks then. Bye.